I'm Carol Willis, the director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I recognize some familiar faces, but there were many names on the list that were new to me. So how many people are here at the museum for the very first time? Great. Well, welcome. And I hope you had time to look around the exhibition a little bit, or that you will in one of the other evenings, because this lecture series is the expansion and the footnoting and the embroidery of the ideas that are present in this exhibition. It's a project and research that I've been working on for a very long time. In fact, I had to dredge out of old filing cabinets like 20-year-old notes that I had handwritten, and V-loxes and various kinds of antique technologies for reproduction from microfilm. There's all sorts of arcane knowledge that I hope I'll be able to bring to you, and an overall interpretation of modernism in America, and especially in New York, that I think is not the one that one normally finds in the textbooks. It's something that I've been working on for a very long time, and I'm very happy to return to, because in the meantime I started the Skyscraper Museum. And for those of you who don't know about its history, I founded the museum in 1996. Our first exhibition was in 1997 on Wall Street, at 44 Wall Street, and we occupied a series of vacant bank branches, and we were a nomadic institution until 2004, when we got this space, when we opened this space. So we've been here for almost 4 years. The building we were partnered from the beginning with the developers, so we knew that we would have a space, and the brilliant contemporary design by our architect Roger Duffy of SOM really expands the sense of verticality, and we think helps to give a sense of the scale of the skyscraper, even in a space that's as small as this. So, so when you do come back for other exhibitions and see this one, I hope that you'll feel, as we do, that we can constantly reinvent the space and also explore new ideas. Now, this exhibition is the first of 3 parts that's called Future City 2021. 20, the 20th century, 21, the 21st century. And by leading this series by looking at New York as the city of the future, we hope to also compare the developments in global urbanism today, and the embrace of the skyscraper as an instrument for modernization and urbanization that you see in the next exhibition, which will be called Vertical Cities, Hong Kong, New York, that will compare these 2 great skyscraper cities. And the third one, which is on Shanghai, that looks at new skyscrapers there in China, and one sees throughout China, as a kind of harbinger or forecast of the directions of the 21st century. So this exhibition is part an opportunity for me to indulge my great love of the 1920s, marginally more the 1930s, but also to explore various ideas of my long time toiling in the libraries and the articles of the early 20th century. So what I hope to do in this series of talks, which, as you know, will sort of continue to explore through the work of key figures. After tonight's overview, there's a featured evening on Hugh Ferris, another one on Harvey Wiley Corbett, a third one on Raymond Hood, and then a final one on Rockefeller Center, which allow me to go into detail within the careers of these really seminal architectural thinkers. Well, they're not always thought of as theoreticians, but I think I know I will make an argument tonight that they really came to terms with an idea of modern architecture that was born of the problems of the contemporary city, and that the most contemporary city in the world in the 1920s, of course, was New York. It probably still is. I mean, I would certainly argue that it is. But New York in the 1920s, in 1925, became the world's most populous city. Largest city in the world in population. It surpassed London with about 6 million people. And that idea of modernism taking shape, taking root in the skyscraper and finding expression through the technology of transportation, of tall buildings, and of the teeming populations of New York is what informs these ideas of the city of the future. There are several ideas that I'm going to reject and then one I'm going to argue for about the idea of the future being the equivalent of modernism. The future is by definition modern, especially in 1900 and 1920s. So that I think that you can explore the idea of modernism through ideas of the city and through these architects' ideas. So that's what we're going to look at in these series of images. As you see when you came into the exhibition, the first image that really sets the stage, Manhattan Island, seen, envisioned as the city of the future by the architect Raymond Hood, who in 1929 proposed in a series of drawings that are in our exhibition here of a city 20 years hence. The project is called Manhattan 1950. And as you can see, skyscrapers explode at various hubs, separated by a rational system of transit. New York served by a multiplication of the bridges, about 24 of them. And as Hood imagined them, a community of bridge dwellers. And this is a drawing in the exhibition that has skyscraper pylons that become apartment communities where people can arrive by water or they can take the bridge across. So like a Brooklyn Bridge multiplied 24 times and turned into habitation for the expanding population of New York, the city that was growing ever larger, adding immigrants, adding population of rural dwellers, so that the city was the magnet for the multitudes. The next. And the idea of the city of the future really fascinated architects and planners of the day, and so we're going to look at a whole series of these images. This happens to be one of the views from the regional plan of New York and its environs, published in 1929, 1930. It's the renewal of a dense urban district, the 10th Ward, on the Lower East Side, and this is called the Christie-Forsyth Project because Christie Street and the avenues Christie and Forsyth are cleared out of their tenement districts and rebuilt as avenues of towers and efficient transportation of suppressed highways and tree-lined boulevards above. So aerating the city, turning it into something which is rationalized and efficient, from converting it from the 5-story walk-ups and the densest district of the world during the early 20th century, the Lower East Side. The next. Imagining the city reformed by towers, and this is one of Hugh Ferris's great renderings from about 1926. And you'll see in the exhibition and also later the advertisement for which, or not an advertisement, but a popular feature in the magazine Vanity Fair in the 1920s. And it was called The Future of New York. I think it was the topless towers of marvelous Manhattan, and then it goes on with a very florid language. But this is the kind of inebriated response to the metropolis that was part of every magazine that you opened up if you were a subscriber to any one of the popular magazines like Vanity Fair or Saturday Evening Post through the mid-1920s. The next. Other of Hugh Ferris's images. Some of the fixations we're looking at here, again, you see elevated highways, bridging streets, sometimes separating pedestrians from vehicles because the proliferation of cars was causing greater and greater concern with, obviously, congestion of traffic, but also pedestrian deaths. And so one of the things that was a way that architects foresaw to rationalize the city of the future was to keep rail, foot, and vehicles separated. And then, of course, there have to be airplanes, too. Next, so that flying machines also, like skyscrapers, are pioneering whole new areas of the ether. The scale, too, at which the architects imagined this future evolving was at a megastructure scale, and the many views that Hugh Ferris described in a whole range of drawings, but especially collected in his famous book, The Metropolis of Tomorrow. This one was also featured in. Foresee this kind of rationalized future city. The next. And like the big mural behind you, some of these ideas are taken to perhaps a logical conclusion, but certainly to an extreme. And I think, probably most of us would be profoundly distressed to occupy a city that looked like this. It's by an architect, Francisco Mujica, a Peruvian architect who practiced, who was a professor in Mexico, who wrote a wonderful book that we have a copy of here called The History of the Skyscraper. And the very last plate of it is this 100-story city in a neo-American style. And he found and he explored the idea of an American roots for the stylistic development of the skyscraper, which he saw as the pre-Columbian or South American pyramids. And then he brings that into the technological future, and again, lifting the cars and the pedestrians even higher than the cars and having free-flowing canals of vehicles below. The next, and there are many versions of this. One way that it enters the popular culture is through movies, and this is a still from the stage set or from the movie set for a movie called Just Imagine. I don't know if you've seen it. There's about a minute's worth of clips on one of our video screens back there. It is a really silly film and a lot of fun. It was called a science fiction musical. It was produced by Fox in 1930, so it was an early talkie and it was an early musical. And there were lovers who tried to meet in a sort of prohibited sci-fi world where everyone had a number but not a name. But the set in which they played, they played out these scenes, was an enlarged version in 3D of the Hugh Ferris future city. And indeed, the set designers, Stephen Goosen and Ralph Hammerus, credited Ferris as the influence for their idea for the city of the future in the movie set. And this was built inside of a blimp hangar in Hollywood, so it was 225 feet long. So this was not a miniaturized version, but something as big as almost a football field that you could walk through. The next. So from the range of fantasy and science fictions, imaginings of the future, to the serious considerations of architects about how to solve the problems of the present city. These are two views of proposals that were rendered of the ideas of Harvey Wiley Corbett, one of the leading architects in New York of his day. And, again, the separation of vehicles, the upper stories, the utilization of the upper stories, landing pads and all of that was, in particular, Corbett's obsessive concern. The next. And there were others, like a rather eccentric inventor whose name was Robert Lafferty. This is the Lafferty plan for transit, traffic, and freight. And the idea that skyscrapers would be the pylons for bridges, like in the Raymond Hood project. Here they support the suspension bridges so that at regular intervals you would be able to travel along these wired bridges and have depots within the skyscrapers. And they serve also various kinds of landing pads and steamship wharves, so that the idea of efficient transportation and the nexus between these levels is something that Lafferty is recommending. The next, please. And then there were lots of really bad ideas. And so here is New York of the future as envisioned by a highway engineer in the days before Robert Moses even. You can see it's about 6 levels of highways, one put right on top of the other, and just plowing their way through Manhattan. With lots of bridges. But you can appreciate how concerned they were about the problems of traffic when you see how much attention they paid and how credible this seemed to people at the time. The next. And, here's another really bad idea, having airplanes, which were rather small at the time, landing on the tops of skyscrapers with landing pads and runways that bridge the tops of towers in this giant pinwheel. The next. And a whole series from about 1929 when the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design proposed a airport of the future as one of their projects. So this is one version. The next one, a prize winner, as you can see. The next, or these giant stilted substructures for a landing pad that you can see is just off the East River in Lower Manhattan, because you can recognize the Woolworth Building and the Singer Building and Bankers Trust here in the foreground. The next. Or blimps, which were, still a principal way that they imagined transporting people, like in ships, back and forth across the ocean, and indeed they did. And, how do you land them? You can land them after 1931. They thought, at the top of the Empire State Building, or you can moor them at the edge of the city and combine different kinds of aerial transport and land on the tops of skyscrapers there and go directly down to your meeting below or to some subway that'll take you up to Midtown. The next. And these ideas are not new in the 1920s, but they're exploring and expanding the kinds of new realities that New Yorkers were confronted with from the turn of the 20th century. And this is one of the things that the exhibition explores. So what I'd like to do here is to have you remember and absorb this last range of images and contrast it with this next sequence where this happens to be one of the Sunday supplement color studies from about 1909 from the newspaper, The New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's World. And the illustrator is showing you the subject of the article, which is New York already has 7 levels of transit. There they are. They're imagining these are existing skyscrapers, and the 6 levels are already down here. They're also imagining an airport on tops of the skyscraper there, the next. And about the same time, 1908-9, in that case right there, you see 2 of the large souvenir versions of the King's Dream of New York and the King's Views of New York, where, as they discuss in a very florid caption at the bottom, where there's like the great heart of the cosmopolis teems with energy and people. You can see that in the sky above, and in this one, as opposed to the 1911 version, which is also in our case, so you can see right there where they have triplanes, three levels of wings. In between 1907, when they were drawing this, and the 1911 version, flight is invented. The Wright brothers flew in 1903, but as Jim Rassenberger discussed here just last month, it's really 1908 when their achievement becomes internationally known. So, here we are really at the beginning of living in the sky, in skyscrapers, and occupying the sky with modern transport, where an elite population can achieve those heights, but also have to battle for their space in the air. The next. And as illustrators at the turn of the century, so I'm talking about a period from about 1900 through the early 19-teens, imagined the city of the future and illustrated it in this whole series of popular magazines. This one happens to be an image by William Robinson Lay, who later drew cowboys to make his name and his fortune, but he was an illustrator for the Cosmopolitan back in the early 20th century and lived in New York. Here he imagines the metropolis of the future as simply a more congested version of the city of the present, where buildings are extruded from their lot lines, as in the King's Views, straight up, where there isn't an extra air shaft, where there's hardly any sunshine, and the way to get from one side to another are bridges in the air because it's not worth descending to the street. The next. Then this really large view of an even earlier, a turn-of-the-century image, a projection, here by the illustrator Louis Biederman for, again, the New York World, and a projection at the turn of the 20th century of what New York would be in 1999, as you can see up in the corner. And here, the same idea that the city is growing without control. There's no way that you can manage the capitalist energy and dynamic. There's no way that technology isn't going to utterly change the way that you occupy urban space. So here, a buzz with airships, congested, chaotic. This is the idea that one sees as the city of the future through the teens. The next, please. However, it's in sharp contrast to what architects are imagining at the time. So that you see the Chicago plan of 1909, Daniel Burnham and others, conceived of and rendered by Jules Guérin here for the Commercial Club of Chicago, the businessmen of the city, and following in the tradition of the White City of the 1893 Columbian Exhibition, this idea of an ordered city on classical principles with broad avenues and diagonals, with tree-lined, light-filled thoroughfares, and with buildings, as Chicago had at the time, controlled by a building code that said no more than, in fact, at the time in Chicago, was no more than, I think, 130 feet building height, so a 14-story building. So Chicago, the city of skyscrapers, if we begrudgingly give them that they're the joint city of the invention of the skyscraper, along with New York, who at the same time as New York were pioneering tall buildings. By 1893, they had capped building heights at 130 feet. So this idea of an urban order classical, rational, but within a recognizable style of what a city was supposed to be, like imperial Rome, like Paris on the lake, as they called it in this plan. This was the architect's Beaux-Arts vision of the city of the future. The next. What I'm arguing then is that the 1920s version of the architect's city of the future is in sharp contrast to the illustrator's views of the turn of the century and to the architect's views of the turn of the century. By the 1920s, led by such delineators as artists as Hugh Ferris, because Hugh Ferris never built a building, and such architects as Harvey Wiley Corbett and Raymond Hood, men who were practitioners and not theoreticians, they nevertheless invented a vision. They drew on the contemporary city and the problems that they wanted to solve, and invented an idea of the city of the future that was rationalized and controlled. And this in stark contrast to a city that just grows chaotically, over which there seems to be no hope of ever reining it in, or this architect's classicizing vision, which is an adopted influence that would have then been brought into the city. Here we have a real American vision of the city of the future. The next. To evoke more with Ferris's image is some of the monumentality that he imagined in here, the metropolis of tomorrow. The next. So what are the narratives of modernism in which my interpretation stands in contrast to? So the next. The typical way that, at least when I was in graduate school, and this is now quite a long time ago, but I think it's, still stands, the principal narrative of American modernism is that it's adopted from Europe. That you have things like, and this is the Armory Show of 1913, where Brancusi and others exhibited their work. The next two, 1931, when the international style is introduced to New York, at least in the guise of an exhibition at the Just Born Museum of Modern Art, which doesn't have a home yet, but is being shown here in temporary quarters in the Heckscher building, where you see in pictures and in models with the Villa Savoie, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, you see this vision of a modern architecture that came to be called the international style, but was called then a modern architecture. So between the European influences of the Cubists, the Futurists, and all of the other avant-garde isms that were brought from Europe to the U.S., or either by European architects who came to New York to experience the city and to promote themselves, or Americans who went to Europe to study in Paris, let's say, at the École des Beaux-Arts, whether they were architects or artists, and to absorb the ideas of the School of Paris or of Cubism and bring them back to the United States, where people like Stieglitz and others introduced Americans to these avant-garde artists. So between those poles of the 19-teens and the 1930s, when the narrative of modernism as the international style adopted from the masters like Le Corbusier or Gropius or Mies and the Bauhaus being introduced and accepted and assimilated into American modernism, between those poles there's not much space for an American modernism, but that's what I'm proposing. The next. So the handbill and the poster for the Armory Show that you see there, the international exhibition of modern art and from people from all over. The next. And of course, it was at that exhibition that the Duchamp's nude descending a staircase was shown, and the reaction of the cartoonists in New York here with the rude descending a staircase. So there was a subway staircase that you see there. Basically, the European avant-garde artists who were shown at the Armory Show caused great hubbub and consternation and ridicule, and were not well accepted except by a small group of aficionados and collectors, and were embraced by enough New Yorkers that they became resident here. The next, but people just made merciless fun of, this is a Picabia painting of a figure, but it was interpreted rather as Granny and her quilt that you see there is like the invention of Cubism. The next. So in 1913, New York audiences were not ready for European modernism in painting particularly. And indeed, in 1913, this was modern in New York. The Woolworth Building was brand new in 1913. It was replacing the generation of buildings that were 5 and 6 stories, or the first generation of skyscrapers that might have been 10 or maybe 15 stories. But at 55 stories and 792 feet, the world's tallest building was certainly a demonstration of American know-how, of technological and engineering prowess, but it certainly wasn't a dramatic statement of modernity in architecture. It was called the Cathedral of Commerce. And in its Gothicizing style, it certainly represented what the architectural community thought was a beautiful building. It was well received. But it absolutely participated in the battle within American architecture, which was pretty much a continuation of the 19th century. In what style shall we build? And for the skyscraper, a natural style, some people argued, was the attenuated, tall, Cathedral of Commerce spirituality of the verticality of the Gothic style. But others came up with other ideas, and we'll see some examples of those later. But let's look at how John Marin experienced the Woolworth Building and the kind of American responses to modernization and skyscrapers that you see with those artists who did travel to Europe, who were a part of the fertile ground in which the theoreticians and the avant-garde artists of Europe influenced a generation of early American modernists. The next, please. Abraham Wolkowitz, also responding to the idea of the city, here the subways in New York and the skyscrapers in New York, and they wrote very eloquently about the inspiration that the city brought them. This is well known in the description of American modernism. What I'm arguing, though, is it's not just the skyscrapers that are an inspiration for American modernism in architecture, but it's the problems of modernization in the modern city of New York and how to solve those, on which architects trained their attention. And it was through that, through those ideas, through the problems of the city, not the celebration of it necessarily, that they found a modern style. And we'll now continue to explore that. But first, we'll look at John Marin's work, because it's Lower Manhattan spread out from the top of the Woolworth Building. So that's the gold glint of the Woolworth Building's tiles. And he's looking down at the city below. The next. Or Max Weber sort of responding to the pace and the sort of frenetic activity of modern life in rush hour, absorbing cubism from Europe, but adapting it to the subject matter of the city. The next. Or by 1917, a truly heretical avant-garde artist, again, Marcel Duchamp as Armut, showing at one of the exhibitions, to the outrage of many, his urinal signed as a ready-made work of art. But it's shown here in the pages of The Blind Man, which was one of these small magazines, the Anti-Bourgeois, the Little Review, a whole series of magazines that were published by a group of bohemians who lived in Greenwich Village, who advanced very anti-establishment ideas, and really had a world and a culture which was completely separate from the architects of the period. So these are a sort of a theoretical and a social disconnect between the kind of modernism that is going to play out in what we look at here. Although there's a little bit of overlap, and when we come back to the Machine Age exhibition in 1927 in New York, and Hugh Ferris's participation, he was actually a friend and colleague of the producer of some of these little magazines, the Little Review. The next. So the European modernism in architecture, now that we've looked away from the art movements, the visual arts, specifically to architecture, again, this is the International Style Show that was curated by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson at the Museum of Modern Art, Young Museum of Modern Art in 1931. The next. And what they were showing, of course, is the architecture of the European avant-garde, like Le Corbusier and his 1929 Villa Savoye, the next. But from his earlier ideas, you're seeing it in an American sort of survey book of modernism. In Corbusier's from 1922 on, idea of the contemporary city. So you see how dramatically different the European idea of the contemporary city is with its horizontality, somewhat the same in terms of the highways and the separation of cars, and with Corbusier, the glass skyscrapers, cruciform skyscrapers. But the spread out version, this is the vision by the late 1930s that will have triumphantly persuaded Americans that the international style was the definition of modern. The next. Other influences like the Bauhaus, of course. The next in a whole series of images that show you the Bauhaus in its sort of typical severity of its black and white imagery, of its industrialized elements, its planar, non-decorated facades, so that the form speaks unornamented. The next, please. Or, of course, in Gropius's director's office, with the austerity and the spare nature, the planarity, the focus on abstract in textiles, on abstraction as a definition of modern. Next. Or in the housing projects by Mies van der Rohe, the next place, at the Wiesenhof in Stuttgart, the big housing exhibition in 1927, where the emphatic horizontals, whether they're banded windows or these continuous balconies, give you the sense of the horizontal stretch that was emphasized and was one of the 5 characteristics that were outlined by Hitchcock and Johnson. The next. So that idea does enter American architecture, in particular in one building in 1930, the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, PSFS, by William Lescaz and George Howe. And because I have this constant problem with my skyscraper images not filling anywhere near the full screen of the horizontal PowerPoint, you're seeing it next to the classic example of Art Deco decorum in the RCA building. And I should have an article to recommend to you, those of you who have access to JSTOR. You can retrieve this 1965 article, which is really quite excellent, on the relevance of the decade by Robert A.M. Stern. And he, of course, has since written a whole number of books on New York architecture, including one on 1930, where he talks about modern classicism. But back in, can you believe this is 1965, he wrote this article, over 40 years ago, for a paper that he delivered at the Society of Architectural Historians. And it was at a time when there was absolutely no questioning of the idea that European international style modernism was modernism. That was the only definition that was orthodox and appropriate. And because I think this is really an excellent article, and I would recommend it to you, and I will talk more in subsequent lectures about the idea of sort of minute detail to each year of the 1920s and how things change. But the one thing that I have to criticize, or only because it will amuse you, he mentions here, he says, the projected office tower in Rush City, he's talking about Neutre's visionary Rush City reformed, was to influence the design of PSFS in 1930 to 32. And he calls it, quote, the only significant skyscraper to be built during the period. That's a highly prejudiced view. I mean, obviously, from our perspective, my perspective anyway, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, there's a whole series of significant skyscrapers. But this is just to underscore a narrative of modernism that absolutely excluded buildings like the RCA building or the Chrysler building or the Empire State Building or any of the buildings of the 1920s from being modern architecture. The next. While most of you are members of the Art Deco Society, I'm going to talk about sort of Deco in context through the whole span of the focuses of the lecture, so that this view of sort of triumphant New York at the end of the boom period of the 20s and before even here, probably after the crash, because one of these buildings is finished after about 1931 or 2. You see Lower Manhattan, at least, with its great Art Deco towers. The next, please. And the influence of another modernism, another narrative of modernism that really develops as a narrative from the 1970s on. And when I started graduate school at Columbia, my teacher, Rosemary Bletter, had just finished her book on skyscraper-style Art Deco New York. And that was the first book that really took seriously by an academic architectural historian the architecture of this period, or Art Deco architecture. That style in New York and elsewhere is influenced, of course, by the Parisian 1925 exhibition, the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels, of which you see a view down one of the corridors. The next, please. Or a pavilion, the Galerie Lafayette Pavilion that you see here with its great attention to ornament, its latent classicism, its highly ornate, almost jewel-like attention to filigree and floral and fountains. These are the motifs that are embraced very quickly within the New York sort of marketing machine. I forgot to mention it before, but the next, please. As we pay attention now to the 1920s as they unfold in the decade, I think it's worth drawing the analogy today, which seems to me so appropriate, between the idea of modernism that exists in the early 20s or the mid-1920s and by the late 1920s. Because if you think today about green building and sustainability, the same sort of entry and dissemination within the culture has existed in the last 2 years with green. We did an exhibition called Green Towers for New York that went up in January of 2006, so 2 years ago. And everything was new then. We were featuring people who already had buildings that were being built. They were the pioneers and we were showcasing them. But 2 years later, green is everywhere. It's full-page advertisements in the New York Times. It's the greenwashing of BP and Exxon and everybody else. You can't get away from green in the popular culture. And that's exactly what happened in modernism between about 1926, 7, and 1929. That explosion about the idea of what modernism was, the embrace of it throughout the culture, is something that came very quickly but was preceded by regular steps that are rational, that make sense, that make us understand modernism in a different way. And when you think about how it's necessary not to elide the popularity of modernism by 1928 and 29, when everybody knew about it, with the origins of it in 1922, 3, 4, 5, 6, you have the essence of my argument about a different kind of way of understanding American modernism. The next, please. Now, the way that everybody understood for a long time American modernism was that it belonged to one man, Frank Lloyd Wright. He was interested in the skyscraper early on. The next, please. By actually the 1920s, he was in decline. That is, his life was a mess. He was near bankruptcy. He had a few commissions in California, in Japan. I mean, they were significant commissions, but he wasn't in the mainstream anymore. He wasn't a newsmaker so much. He kept trying to get attention with buildings like the National Life Insurance building that you see there. And indeed, by 1929, this is the frontispiece from an important book called The New World Architecture by Sheldon Cheney. Sheldon and Martha, they were co-authors. She doesn't appear on the title page, however. The next, please. Now, the narrative of American modernism, when seen from the vantage of the Eurocentrism that long ruled this academic interpretation, looks at the key event of the early 1920s, the Chicago Tribune competition. Certainly in the history of the skyscraper it's that. But it takes the Tribune competition as a manifest demonstration of the conservatism, the hopeless conservatism of American architects. The next, please. It was run in 1922. It was won by Raymond Hood with his Gothic tower together with John Mead Howells. And, most scholars and people at the time said, oh, God, what a shame. Well, when will America ever pull itself out of the mire of 19th century historicism? Please. This is what the judging hall looked like, so you can see the scale of the entries. The next, please. The critics in American magazines and international magazines much preferred the second place winner. It was Émile Saarinen, as they called it, a styler or a non-historicist design. And as a consequence of the great publicity and reputation that he received from being the second place winner, he emigrated to the U.S. and became the head of Cranbrook. The next, please, and then the father of Eero Saarinen. And then other entrants that, again, for most critics, confirmed how hopelessly ridiculously conservative American architects were. This is Harvey Wiley Corbett's entry. So in 1922, this is what he thought might well be a prize-winning design. It didn't even get honorable mention, though, but we'll see some of the next, please. The other ones, Louis Bourgeois, again, in sort of a Gothic stretch. The next got an honorable mention, as did the design of Benjamin Wister Morris, sort of classicizing New York-based architects. The next, please. Or, this is always one of my favorites, Frank Fort, who also got an honorable mention and put a little temple on top of his stretched base. But we'll see this in Hugh Ferris drawings of the same year. The next, please. Or Ralph Walker, who became one of the great modern architects of the late 20s, or Art Deco, if you want to call him that, who designed the Irving Plaza Tower at 1 Wall Street. The next. But, in contrast to the Europeans, I mean, this was, people argue about whether this was a joke or serious or what was his motivation, but this is the great columnar form that, like the newspaper column, they think it's a play on, of Adolf Loos, a black basalt building that he imagined as a homage to the column, or perhaps to American newspapers, or perhaps just a jeer at America's attachment to classicism. The next. The modernist entries by, this is Bijouet, who was a Dutch architect. And you can see the horizontality of, we would call it kind of streamlined style, but you recognize the Stuttgart Siedlungen housing vocabulary that we saw as examples of Mies's work. The next, please. Or Max Taut, who prefigures the glass and steel box of post-war modernism. The next. Or by far the most famous of the unsuccessful entrants. This was Walter Gropius's design, where he took the idea of the Chicago school of the pre-turn of the 20th century, of the Chicago window, the tripartite Chicago window that expands the whole wall into a glass surface, which projects some balconies out from that, and is a simple rectilinear tower, just sort of straight up, all glass, express structure, a perfect expression of European modernism. The next, please. And look back at, a brief look at someone who's very important within the whole description of this evolution of American modernism, but doesn't get all that much credit, and it's Bertram Goodhue, who also got an honorable mention with this design. And the thing that I want to point out, and I will continue over the course of these lectures to emphasize, is the simplicity of mass and the treatment of the building as a sort of carved lithic form. That, the next please, is a signature of Goodhue, which we'll see again in a few moments, I guess. And you can sort of see it in Hugh Ferris's image, homage to another building that he is designed, which was never realized, for Madison Square, the Convocation Tower. We'll see that in a moment. But also in 1922, the Tribune competition has always been seen as the sort of hallmark event around which you can interpret the status of modern architectural thinking in America in the early 20s. But this is also 1922, March 19th, 1922. It's in our exhibition. It's a very, very important sequence of drawings that were created by Hugh Ferris in 1922 called the 4 Stages of the Zoning Envelope. And the zoning had been written and passed into law in 1916. It had already been in effect in New York for 6 years, the setback zoning, which we'll talk about in great detail in other lectures. But what you can see here, too, is in 1922, the idea that Ferris was already interpreting, actually with the help of Harvey Wiley Corbett, of the way that zoning would affect the future city. So he's extrapolating from the conditions and the new constraints of the building code in New York and imagining how the city will evolve in the future from that. And so in this very important article in the New York Times magazine in 1922, he promoted that idea. The next, please. And then he promoted it and promoted it and promoted it. And you saw it all over. It was in the Saturday Evening Post. It was in the Architectural League's exhibition. The drawings, which are now in the collection of the Cooper Hewitt Museum, traveled across America in a series of exhibitions. It was in a series of textbooks of the period. Everywhere you looked, in architectural magazines, but also in popular magazines, in the Saturday Evening Post. The idea of the zoning envelope and those 4 drawings were featured. And they were embraced by architects. And when we talk about Ferris next week, we'll talk especially how many architects credited Ferris with the vision of a new architecture. And that's what he called this. The title of the article is A New Architecture. The next, please. This is the Goodhue Ferris drawing of the Goodhue Convocation Tower for the corner of Madison Square, where the New York Life Insurance Tower now stands. The next, please. In 1922, Ferris continued to play out in his imagination the idea of the city of the future, of setback skyscrapers as described by the zoning law, of very big buildings that occupied full city blocks, but were nevertheless ornamented and sort of decorated and interpreted through the prevailing artistic conventions of the time, which is classicism or Gothicism, but historical styles. So in 1922, Ferris doesn't yet know what a modern architecture looks like. So his new architecture takes over the language of historical styles. The next, please. And he does this in a number of drawings. We'll talk about him more next week as a kind of Byzantine influence for the tops of the towers. But you can see the buildings are very big, and they occupy these sort of heroic scaled sites. The next, please. In a series of drawings and articles in popular magazines, he plays out this idea. The next. But at the same time, he starts to develop another idea about modern architecture, not just new architecture, that takes the direction of abstraction. And this is called crude clay for architects. And when we made the model of the zoning law in the exhibition, we had one of our talented staff sculpt in plasticine, which is the way that architects worked in the 1920s when they were molding and modeling things. He treats the buildings as if they're solid forms sculpted down. And these are the diagonals of the zoning envelope that you saw in those 4 drawings. The next, please. And when they're cut off into the rectilinear forms of steel cage construction, here it's called, that one was crude clay for architects, this one is buildings and the modeling is the title of this drawing. And the buildings become these mountainous, gigantic abstractions, sculptural forms. The next, please. And modernism takes the direction in American architecture, especially in New York, shaped by the template of the zoning law, unveiled by the vision of Hugh Ferris, pared down to the simplicity of form that became the equivalent of a modern style. The next. Ferris himself rendered all buildings in this dark chiaroscuro, or as these kind of sculptural simple masses. That's the Shelton Hotel, the next, please, which by 1924 was built on Lexington Avenue and 50 First Street, and still stands there today. Looking like that, was one of the first buildings that really expressed the simplicity and the monumentality of the setback law without being somehow disguised under historical ornament. The next, please. And there's a whole series of buildings, like the Barclay Vesey Telephone Building of about 1924 by Ralph Walker, that pursued this same idea. It's an idea that often gets called Art Deco, but for me is a new kind of treatment of modernism, which has to do with form, not with ornament. The next, please. The other obsessions and other practitioners like Harvey Wiley Corbett, who collaborated with Ferris for Ferris's drawing here of a setback city of skyscrapers, again focusing on his particular preoccupation with traffic separation. The next, please. In a series of drawings that were made for the regional plan of New York and its environs in 1923 and 1924. So what I'm doing now is taking apart the 1920s and showing you the evolution of a modernism that happens from 1922, 1923, 1924, which is a logical progression of ideas that express themselves first with a kind of historicism laid over the top, but increasingly as the decade progresses through a dramatic abstraction that is the equivalent of the direction of an evolution of a modern style of architecture. The next, please. In an event in 1925 called the Titan City at the Wanamaker store. The next, please, just to show you a few examples of actually Hugh Ferris's drawings of the zoning envelope on the selling floor of the men's suit department with a monoplane in the middle. It was bought for this occasion by John Wanamaker. He was like so excited about airplanes, and he bought this one in order to feature it right in the center as a, as a publicity and an attraction. But the Titan City explored the history of New York. It was the tercentennial celebration, a 300-year celebration of from 1626 to 1926, New York's history, but then New York of the future, the Titan City, a city of skyscraper megastructures. The next, please. Ferris is painting the murals here in his studio, and then you see the very good Hueyan Central Cathedral, as well as some of the other airports on roofs and all of that. The next, please. Raymond Hood's idea of the bridge buildings is something that they collaborated on in a number of different works, and this is Ferris's version of it. The next, please. Or someone else rendered for Harvey Wiley Corbett, a different artist, but for the same occasion, for the Titan City, this bridge buildings and monumental skyscrapers lining highways. The next. This obsessive interest with the future at a time that New York was changing so dramatically and was looking to identify a style that was modern really enters popular culture and artistic culture. From Titan City was 1925, it's still a little corny in the imagery. By 1926, and especially 1927, which is the subject of Robert Stern's article, 1927 is really sort of a key year. A lot of things happen then. End of the Model T, beginning of the Model A. Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic. There's a tremendous amount of technological shifts. And the idea of modernism as the machine age is played out in a whole range of venues. And in this artist's exhibition, the next, please, for which Hugh Ferris was the organizer of the architectural section, and for which he designed a glass skyscraper designed by Hugh Ferris, will be a sensational feature. The next, please. It probably looks something like this, which is skyscrapers that he drew for Raymond Hood on commission for a popular magazine. Next. Or something like these sort of glowing glass buildings, rather crystalline, faceted, seem to glow from within as if they predict a glass architecture rather than a stone lithic monumentality. This is the page from Vanity Fair, a prophetic glimpse by Hugh Ferris, the topless towers of marvelous Manhattan. The next. Or his famous drawing of 1929, so a couple of years after this, of philosophy, which is featured in The Metropolis of Tomorrow. Or next. Or the design that he rendered for his friend and often client, Harvey Wiley Corbett, for a skyscraper that dramatically contrasted with the world's tallest tower in 1909. This was the new Metropolitan Life Tower that was imagined as alternately as an 80-story or 100-story building. It was never a very realistic design, even as it was described to be glass with metal mullions, and that violated the building code in New York at the time. So we know that this was something that was just floated out there as a trial balloon kind of thing, or to generate interest, but they didn't really plan to build it. But nevertheless, it expressed many of those ideas that we can see are being born at the time, a glass architecture, at a time that there was no technological capacity to build that. The next, please. So now we're getting now to the end and a predictor of the series of themes that we'll explore in the next 4 talks. Here we have Harvey Wiley Corbett and Raymond Hood and others of the associated architects of Rockefeller Center looking at the models of the massing, and you can see they're made of plastic. They're thought of as solid masses. They're sculpted like Hugh Ferris's drawings. And here they are pretending to move things around and think about how these buildings are disposed on the site. The next, please. On this extremely large site. As early as 1924, Corbett was thinking of an art center for the future. Ferris rendered it for him. It was commissioned by the Regional Plan of New York and its environs to imagine the future city by a series of very serious planners, urbanists, the demographers, and the fellows who came together to be, there were of course men, the planners of the Regional Plan of New York were serious urbanists on a crusade to transform the city in the modern era. They commissioned a few images, and this is the one by Corbett's conception and Ferris's hand. The next, please. Corbett then became fascinated by the idea of the Art Center. He proposed it for the first version of the limited competition for the Rockefeller Center, and this is the rendering Ferris did for him on that occasion. And then the next one. And it looks very much the direction of the development of the actual Rockefeller Center, and again, rendered in plasticine, where you can see the roof gardens, you can see the tower masses. You can see, the next one, please. You can see the vision of the city of the future that we've looked at across the 1920s. Materialized in Manhattan in 3 blocks between avenues, 3 cross streets long, an avenue wide, a swath of the city on a scale, 22 acres, the same size as Atlantic Yards today, of an ideal urbanism that actually is realized. The city of the future built in New York. And it's that idea that we'll continue to explore in other lectures, and which helps us, I think, understand, to grasp the optimism that these architects brought to their attempts to grapple with, to cope with the problems of the contemporary city. And they found a solution in modern architecture, and in doing so, in looking into the future, they defined modernism. And in drawing that future, they helped to create an American modernism that's born of the city. It's a function of urban problems. It's a solution to these conundrums of the congestion of the city. It's a rational agenda for reforming the city. I think it doesn't work on the scale of Mujica. On the scale of Rockefeller Center, probably the most loved and triumphant urban design that American architects have ever created, it seems to have lasting power. The next, please. There's just a couple more slides to sort of summarize again the historiography of modernism that we looked at, the way subsequent generations looked back and interpreted what was happening in the 1920s and the 1930s from the point of view of a triumphant international style modernism. But in the 1920s, the cover of Sheldon Cheney's book, 1929, when the new World Architecture was published, the cover shows the same kind of Ferrisian idea of an architecture of mass, the architecture of sculpted form, of abstract, unornamented forms like the Bauhaus, but solid, not void. not planes enclosing space, but carved out of mass. And when we look at this kind of summary that Cheney brought to this scope of the architecture of the New World, the modern architecture of the 1920s, this looks like one open spread, but it's actually the first page of his book and the second last page of his book. The last page actually has Corbusier on it. And you see that Hugh Ferris opens it and Hugh Ferris closes the book. The next, please. Another book not much remembered of the period, but also published in 1929 by G.H. Edgell, who was the dean of the Harvard School of Architecture, now the Graduate School of Design. And when he summarized American architecture of today, the next place, the opening frontispiece was the Goodhue's Convocation Tower as rendered by Hugh Ferris. And the next, the last image of the book is a Hugh Ferris fantasy of the city of the future. So it's with Ferris that we end and that we also begin next week and look in detail at the ideas and the rationales and the writings as well as the drawings that helped Ferris define American modernism. Thank you.